Good evening and welcome to the Marsalis Avenue Church of Christ Wednesday night Bible class. We are in the middle of an amazing series on both Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings, looking at different parts of 1 Corinthians. And so today we are returning to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and we are going to start off our lesson beginning at verse number 10. The Bible reads like this: I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same judgment. For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there is quarreling among you, my brothers. What I mean is that each one of you says, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, or I follow Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one may say that you were baptized in my name. I did baptize also the household of Stephanus. Beyond that, I do not know whether I baptized anyone else. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. As we look at 1 Corinthians, and specifically this passage, what are your initial thoughts from the passage? You know, 1 Corinthians is an interesting book. It is a very popular book, and it really shows the personality of Paul the Apostle. Of course, he helped to plant this church. It was a church that was in a hustling and bustling area in the New Testament world. It was known for commerce, a city where resources were coming in and out, and you had growing welfare. And so whereas the people at this church were not always of means, they had come into means, sort of like new money, so to speak. And so not only have they come into new money, but they've also come into this new relationship with God. They've understood the sacrifice and the meaning of Christ and the cross. And so now they're also relatively new Christians. And so when we look at this passage and you address division, a lot of times this passage, which is familiar to many of us, we see how crazy the New Testament church was. I mean, when we say that we attempt to be the New Testament church, what we mean is we attempt to be the ideal of what God intended for the New Testament church. Because the New Testament church looks a whole lot like the 2021 church, the 2022 church, full of divisions, people competing, folks breaking into cliques and into factions. And so when you look at this passage, you see that just like it's drama in our city, drama sometimes in our churches, in the same way, you got that same kind of drama in the Bible right here with these Christians living and going to church at Corinth. One thing that may come to mind is church splits. Every time you look up, a church is planted most likely by it branching off from another church. And it sometimes makes you ask the question, you know, can we get along? Is it even possible for us to, you know, put egos to the side? It also brings up the idea of preacher following. You know, we respect our ministers and we respect our leaders, but there is a risk in treating the leader not just as, you know, God's man, or as the case may be, if with influential women in the church, God's woman, but actually confusing them with God themselves. And so we are familiar with situations where sometimes in churches, members jumped off the cliff because their preacher told them to, because they followed their minister into a place that wasn't good. There's a lot of different things that can come to mind when reading this passage in 1 Corinthians. But there may be also other things. I mean, everything that I just described, things you may think, is right here in this passage. But I also think that maybe there's other things happening that even illuminates the things that we think of right away, and maybe could be sort of even a new or in-depth, a more in-depth way of seeing exactly what's at the root of what Paul is talking about here in this passage. To sort of get at that root, let me ask another question. How do we, and I mean we, me, B. Chris, you listening to this recording, how do we take ourselves too seriously? And give a personal example, like go into your head and think about it and admit it to somebody if you dare. How do we take ourselves too seriously? You know, I've never, in all of my preaching life, which hasn't been long per se, I mean, I started sort of preaching and teaching as a kid, but my professional sort of full-time career started when I was 22 years old. And so that's about 12, going on 13 years ago. And to say the least, I've never really liked being on camera. I mean, even now I'm on camera, but especially like in the sermon context. But COVID really sort of made it worse, that now every single thing is on camera. I mean, we have to keep our visuals up, and preaching on camera is just a way of life now. And it's so funny because, you know, preaching on camera, you actually see what other people see. And you don't always think that you look or sound or act or come across a certain way until you see yourself on camera. And it's like, wow, B. Chris, is this what people see? Is this what they're staring into? I used to wear bow ties. And I said to myself, no, I want to like tie my bow tie, like actually do a bow tie that's tied, because I thought that it looked better. The bows seemed to be fuller. And something about the wild way I preach and move, and my chin rubs up on my shirt and my collar, that bow tie is always crooked. It's always crooked. So I decided, okay, the Lord is leading me away from bow ties in the pulpit. All right, because I was, thinking I look crazy with this bow tie, all flipped upside down. So I said, okay, no more bow ties. All right. I remember when I first really started wearing glasses, and my glasses would slip down because I'm in the pulpit and I'm rowdy, I'm perspiring. And so now my glasses are sliding off. And so I'm doing this the whole time. I once had a fella and his daughter who heard me preach on a conference that I was out of town doing. At a later time, after that conference, maybe a couple of months, I saw them somewhere, and they made the joke that you were touching your glasses so much, B. Chris, we actually counted 42 times that you touched it in one sermon. I was mortified, horrified, embarrassed beyond, let alone the fact that it's sort of strange that they would actually count it, even stranger that they would actually count it and then tell me about it. And so, it can get really strange when you see yourself the way people see you from that vantage point. And then, of course, you got the COVID weight. Now, we all dealt with COVID the best way we could. Some of us did good things like started businesses, expanded our online presence. Others of us just took to coping with the pain and the discomfort of a worldwide pandemic by cooking Thanksgiving every Tuesday, Thursday. Okay, I was in the latter group, and I may or may not have fixed dressing and banana pudding and strawberry cake sort of on a semi-regular basis because I was at home. I couldn't go to restaurants. I had to, get in where I fit in and try to make the best of the situation. And I love to cook. And the only thing I like doing more than cooking is eating. And so there's a chance that the COVID weight found me, and so now you're looking at yourself on the stage and just all these things. And, I'm thinking, oh, I should change this. I should change that. I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't sound like that. And then I catch myself and it's like, but you just taking yourself way too seriously. Because don't nobody care. Your bow tie is crooked, but you ain't up there to talk about your bow tie. The word is what's most important. Okay, you up there, and yeah, you sound weird, your voice is scratchy, you really sound like this in your head, but on camera, you may go in and out, and you're embarrassed because of that, but it's like, but guess what? Don't nobody care about your voice. It's the word that's important. even your weight and them glasses, you should not take yourself so seriously. And I'm telling myself this, like, no one cares. And the only reason you do is because, you're trying to be a man, and you're trying to be a minister, you're trying to act the part, but there is no part. It's just you and God attempting to give a word to the people. And, this can be embarrassing to admit, but I think it's important that we ask ourselves, what is embarrassing to admit? Are we really willing to admit that, no, there are times when I just feel like I'm important, and I'm trying to prove I'm important, and I'm trying to feel important, and I'm just taking myself way too seriously because God don't care and nobody else do either. And so let's talk about this. When you turn your attention to 1 Corinthians in this passage that we just read, oftentimes we sort of lean more toward understanding that passage from a spiritual herd mentality, which is to say, the Christians at Corinth, they're following these men, and they're like splitting up into rival gangs in the church. Well, I am with Paul, and I'm with Cephas, who is Peter the apostle, or I'm with Christ, I'm with, Apollos. And these are heavy-hitting men. They have a certain way about themselves. And because of that, we just think, hey, these Christians, they're just following men. And we often say things like, well, that happens in a lot of churches where folks jump off the cliff because their minister told them to. And I think that's a very valid way to understand what's happening here. I think in addition to that interpretation, we also can look at how this herd mentality of, well, my group is going with Paul, so I'm gonna go with him. My group is going with Apollos, so I'm gonna go with them. My group is fighting, so I'm gonna fight with them. In addition to that herd mentality, there's something underneath it. And I think what's underneath it is actually the pursuit of self-importance. That here at this church, these Christians are wanting to feel self-important, and their desire to be self-important as like this new money, new Christian. I started from the bottom, now I'm here. You know what I'm saying? I'm from the gutter, but now I done moved to the suburbs. I'm on the good side of town now. And so because they have this desire to be and to feel self-important, that is what is actually leading them into a herd mentality where everybody is supposed to split up into groups and then sort of compete with each other to see who's most important. And so the real problem here in 1 Corinthians is self-importance, people pointing at themselves and making these associations and these actions so as to puff themselves up, so as to separate themselves so that they may feel special, more delivered, more popular, more important. Let's look at just 3 phrases in this passage. There are many that we could zero in on, but I think just to help us understand this concept of self-importance, we can start with just these 3. In verse 10b, the phrase appears, be of the same mind and the same judgment. This is the opposite, the antithesis of division. Do not be divided. Do not fight. Paul says instead, as the church, we should have the same mind and the same judgment, working toward the same vision, the same goal, to bring the kingdom of God on earth, to be Christ in the flesh, to reconcile man back to God. Verse 12, Paul, he says, what is this business that you all are gang banging in the church? One of you says, I follow Paul. Another one, I follow Apollos. Yet again, someone says, I follow Cephas, which is very interesting. We're way in Corinth. Peter the apostle most likely didn't spend a lot of time in the ancient Gentile world. He was sort of stationed at Jerusalem in places close to it, working with the Jewish population. As he was sent, Peter, to the Jews, Paul was sent to the Gentiles. It is most likely that these people never even met Peter. They call him here by his Greek name, Cephas, which is the Greek version, Cephas, of Peter, Petros, both meaning rock. And so it's interesting that, you wind up splitting into factions, not even knowing all the facts. And then finally, someone has a sense enough to say, I'm with Christ, but maybe not in the way they should. And then, of course, verse 17, Paul says, it wasn't about the puffed upness, the arrogance, the prestige that comes from following a preacher or banding with your group against another group. He says, no, when I came to you, when I preached the gospel, I did it plainly, not in eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. So let's look at these different phrases and ask some more questions. How does self-importance prevent us from having the same mind and judgment? I think that self-importance is the thing that makes us focus on ourselves. And when you're trying to have the same mind, you're taking 2 minds, 3 minds, 200, 400 minds, and you're attempting to pull all those minds onto the same level into one accord. And the only way you can do that is if each mind considers the other person. If each mind focuses not on themselves, but also on others. And unfortunately, when we become self-important, we do that by focusing most of our attention on ourselves. And so then we lose focus and we become self-centered. And that is so unfortunate because God tells us how important we are. God shows us how beautifully and wonderfully we are made, in that he sends his only son to die for us so as to reconcile us, rebellious men and women, back to himself through grace, not even because of what we did to deserve the reconciliation, but because of his kind and loving heart. We know that we are important because of who we belong to, because we come alongside God and he within us. And so we sort of forfeit that genuine spiritual and very natural importance that comes from being made in the image of God. And we substitute it with divisions based on markers of clout and prestige, even when it sneaks up on us. Let's ask another question, looking at one of those other phrases. How can association with big names like Paul, Apollos, Cephas, and Christ, lead to self-importance? And what types of people, places, or things do we associate with to make ourselves feel important? There's a chance that Paul is using these names literally. There's also a chance that he's not using them as literally. I mean, in 1 Corinthians 4, after this conversation, he actually tells them, listen, I am not a judge. Only God judges, and you're not a judge either. And I'm using all these things just so we can remain humble. He says, God is the judge, and I'm sort of using myself, Paul, and Apollos as sort of like an example more than an actual case study. And so, some scholars believe that maybe he's not actually referencing these people, but the case is still true in that Paul uses these names, whether people were actually in the church choosing these men and following these men, which is likely, or maybe not exactly like this, but the feel of it, that, oh, you guys are splitting up and you're wanting to follow ideas. You're wanting to split up and you're wanting to compete with who's greater because of association. So he uses these men's names, Paul, Apollos, Cephas, Christ, the Christ. I lean more toward these being actual people and actual factions in that church. These are heavy-hitting people, people who are known throughout the Christian world and even the Jewish world, who had done great things. And so because of that, the association that these Christians can strike up by sort of being in this preacher's camp, that gives them a sense of importance, a sense of clout. I must be somebody because I am with this person. I am associated with them. And whereas that's common in many churches and companies and in the world, even if we don't experience that type of association with people or preachers, that we will follow to the end of the earth and back over a cliff. Even if we don't personally identify with that type of struggle, we do identify with that type of struggle in other ways, because each of us are deriving meaning and importance from people, places, or things. All kind of nouns. We're deriving importance from, oh, I'm associated with this neighborhood association. Or at my job, I'm associated with the vice presidents. Or, oh, because because of my fraternity or my sorority or the college I attended. It's unfortunate because all those things are blessings from God. They can be something that he uses to bless our life. But when we start to attach our self-importance to those things, now we have a spiritual problem, because our importance is attached to Christ, us being in him. And so when we stop and think, no, there are also some places, where I'm from, where I live, even if they're figurative places, where I'm going, the types of things you do, even in really small, insignificant ways. I've often seen people state in a very braggadocious way, I don't eat that. I don't go there. And they say it as if being exclusive makes them feel more powerful or more worthy to frown up at the way you cook a dish, or to frown up at going to a certain place to do a certain type of activity. We often derive our importance from people, places, and things, when ultimately our importance comes from God. And that leads us to the last statement we want to discuss. How can things which lead to self-importance, like, quote, words of eloquent wisdom, empty the sacrifice of Christ? I think we could sort of make sense of this question by asking, well, what is the sacrifice of Christ? It's the fact that he was God, though he made himself lowly, so as to die for the lowly, so as to lift them up to be with God. See, the story of the cross, the very idea that Christ had everything to lose and lost it anyway, so he could become like us and walk with us. That he's not a God that's far away only, but he's super close up. That the sacrifice is what made the cross so powerful. The fact that Jesus was broken, the fact that he was poor, the fact that he was from no man's land, Nazareth, where no good thing comes from. The fact that he wasn't much to look at, Isaiah 53, for he is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, yet we hid our faces from him. All these things actually makes the cross more powerful, because it proves that God is real, big, forgiving, that he is humble, that he is making sacrifices for us, even more than the sacrifices he wants from us. It's the lowliness. It's the humility and the humble status of Jesus, and the great sacrifice of what he did, not having to, that makes the cross so powerful. And so Paul says, if I had come speaking eloquent words of wisdom that made me important, or that made you feel important because of your association with me, and somehow we began to think we're important, we're flashy, we've got worth, we can compete with the world, let me at them. He says, you do know that if I was using that type of thinking, that goes against the lowliness of Christ, that Christ And his sacrifice was, in fact, the lowest thing that equaled the highest gain. So Paul says, I wanted to come speaking plainly. I wanted to come speaking humbly, because the way of Christ is a plain way. The way of Christ is a humble way. Why would I come complicated? Or why would I come haughty to talk about that, which in its very essence is plain to see and humble in character and nature, accessible to the rich and the poor, accessible to those who got it together and those who don't, reachable to the smart and those who are not smart, those who have been educated and not educated, those who got the money, who don't, who got the clout and who don't. He says it's accessible to everybody. And so when I came to you, I made it that plain. I came to you that humbly, because if I had come to you with these eloquent words of wisdom, I'm actually emptying the sacrifice of Christ. I'm actually watering down the greatness of what he did, because what Christ did on the cross and on this earth was so great because it took great sacrifice. And so if you take the sacrifice out of it, Christ may have done it because he wanted to rule the world. He may have done it so that he could be a king and lord over us. But instead, he did it because he wants us to come in with him. He wants to live with us. And so then trying to save us for our sake, he sacrifices. The power cannot be missed. And when we become self-important, we miss the power of sacrifice. Self-importance ultimately leads to division. These are just some examples in our own personal life of how self-importance leads to division. In marriage, when one person seeks his or her own needs to feel important, it lessens the needs of their spouse and possibly their spouse is important. See, this business is about, I want to feel powerful. I want to feel good. Me, me, me. And when we're always worried about our needs, it's very difficult to concern ourselves with the needs of others. And sometimes people actually say, well, can't you do both? Well, yes, when you're in the spirit, you can do both. But doing both doesn't always look in the spirit what it looks like in the world. Yes, in the spirit, we do need to step away and take care of ourselves like Jesus did when he prayed. We do need to take care of ourselves. We do need to make sure we're healthy. We do need to care for us. But we can't remember that in caring for us, the reason we do is so that we can serve God more, so that we can love others, so that we can receive what we give to others. And so it's the self-importance that pops up a lot of times in our marriage. And a lot of the division that we have in our marriages is because somebody at some point has become self-important, or they're attempting to keep importance and they're assigning their importance to other things that ain't Jesus. And so when you assign your importance to other stuff, you know, I think that I'm actually arguing with you about the dishes when really you're just trying to be self-important. I think I'm arguing with you about how to spend this money for the children, but you're just arguing about self-importance. You don't want to feel dumb. You don't want to feel less than. And so now we've got this wedge between us, this division, because maybe both of us are desiring to feel important, and we are pushing away that vulnerable feeling that really is necessary to become one. Also in an argument, and this is in marriage, but also at work, at church, with our friends, with our children, sometimes we argue for the sake of being right. And this leads to division because our rightness becomes bigger than our purpose. And ultimately, the other person sitting across the table or the room from us. We all know people who just argue to death so they can be right. It don't matter. Nobody's gonna care. But we just gonna spend the next 15 minutes trying to prove I wasn't wrong though. And if it seems like I was wrong, this is why I wasn't. And you mistook it, or you gave me wrong information. And what happens is when we are so concerned about being right, our desire to be right becomes greater than our desire to love the person we're talking to. And that creates division. In personal growth, feeling too important to endure humbling circumstances can create division between you and those who need you to grow personally for their own sake. What do I mean by that? Okay, sometimes we become so self-important, we cannot grow because growth always has to do with failure, the embarrassing moments, the struggle. We grow way more from these humbling circumstances that can actually make us feel unimportant, unworthy. But it's that trial that actually makes us grow personally and spiritually, to mature us. But it's the self-importance that often makes us avoid negative feelings, avoid conflicts, avoid the hardship that growth requires. And now, you try facing your children when you haven't done what you needed to do to become spiritually mature. Your children need a spiritually mature mother. They need a spiritually mature father. And so they're hoping you grow. But the key to growth is humility and failing. But because you want to remain self-important, you'll never be humble. You'll never fail. So the growth of your children, your spouse, your coworkers, your church, and ultimately you, me, the growth we need for ourselves, we can never get. What we can benefit from, we can't experience because I'm too important to get down on the floor. I'm not going to start my career over and take a pay cut, never. When really, we may just be taking ourselves too seriously. Let's end with these three key concepts. Key concept number one, taking ourselves too seriously is how self-importance sneaks up on us. We don't think about ourselves as self-important. We think, no, I'm holy, I'm spiritual, I love God. But wherever we're taking ourselves too seriously, self-importance by another name. Key concept number two, we should be careful of our associations. They can lead to self-importance. That they were associating at Corinth themselves with these powerful figures. And it led to them feeling like I'm somebody when really they embarrassed Christ and themselves. For this reason, Paul also says in Romans 12:16, associate with others of low position, because who you associate with says a lot about you. And we associate not as humans, but as Christians who have this supernatural deliverance. And so if Christ associated with the lowly, if Jesus himself was lowly, we associate in the same way. And finally, key concept number three, division is often a result of people's self-importance. When we want to be important, what winds up happening is that we offend others. We don't stick up for them. We don't give them the things that they need. We become selfish, push people away, and then ostracize them, even if we didn't mean to. And so what we can learn is if we can address our desire to be self-important in these worldly ways, and instead lean on the importance we get from Christ, the importance that we get from sacrificing and giving up things for others, then we don't have to deal with the hardship of division.